Lawyers of Reddit, what is the most morally challenging case that you've worked on? I'm a lawyer, and I had a case during my externship at the Federal Public Defender's Office. My client had been living in his brother's basement for years. During that time, he repeatedly essayed his nephew, filming the incidents and sharing them online. While there are many details I'm skipping over, he was eventually arrested by state authorities, and the federal authorities took over the case. He was in a hopeless situation. The feds hadn't lost a case like this in almost 2 decades, and the minimum guideline sentence was around 1,600 months, essentially a life sentence. When we visited him, we were the first lawyers he had seen since his arraignment. My supervisor thought it would be a good opportunity to see how I would handle the client. He genuinely couldn't comprehend what he had done wrong. He went into detail about how his nephew was often asleep during the incidents, so it couldn't be a crime. When the child was awake, he said he enjoyed the encounters, along with other deeply disturbing justifications. At the time, I thought it was a terrible idea, but in hindsight, I see the wisdom in my supervisor's decision. I've never felt more enraged and wanted to lose composure than in that moment, but I had to remain completely professional. He was one of the most despicable individuals I had ever met, yet it was our office's duty to represent him and protect his rights. It was a deeply unsettling experience. That moment has stayed with me, even years later. Learning to be dispassionate in your profession is incredibly difficult, especially when dealing with people like him. Compartmentalizing judgment and emotion don't come naturally for most, and it requires years of dedicated practice. Still, I find some comfort knowing that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Story 2. My friend's dad is an attorney who began his career in criminal defense. Early on, he took a case that seemed like a fortunate break at the time. A friend he had known for years was accused of a terrible crime. His wife had been tragically offed while he was away, in a manner that shocked everyone. Her body had been discovered by chance, and only a small amount of circumstantial evidence pointed to the husband. The husband was a well-respected member of the community, and there was no history of conflict between him and his wife. The case seemed weak, and my friend's dad successfully got him acquitted. Later, while they were out having celebratory drinks, the husband confessed to the crime. That moment changed everything. My friend's dad walked out of the bar that night and decided to leave criminal defense behind, switching to corporate law instead. Story 3. During my second year of practice as duty counsel, think of it like a public defender role, I handled a particularly difficult bail hearing. The case involved a man who had trapped his girlfriend in the cab of his pickup truck, twisted one arm behind her back until it reached her shoulder, and broke it. Then, he did the same to her other arm. I had to represent him during the bail hearing, all while his girlfriend and her family sat in the front row of the courtroom. She was there with both arms in casts and slings, a hauntingly visible reminder of what she had endured. Fortunately, the man's proposed surety, the person posting bail on his behalf, had an emotional meltdown while testifying, forcing us to adjourn. By the time his case came up for bail again, he had retained private counsel. Despite my warnings, his new lawyer decided to put the same surety back on the stand, in front of the same justice. The result? He was detained. A small victory in an otherwise grim situation. Story 4. During my time in insurance defense, I spent one unforgettable afternoon arguing with co-counsel over which of us would cover a $5,000 difference that was preventing us from settling a case. This debate took place during a deposition at the plaintiff's home. The plaintiff had been hit, his actual body, by a semi-truck on the interstate. Miraculously, he survived, but it had torn off an arm and a leg, shattered most of his bones, and left him nearly immobile. He was confined to a power chair that he could barely operate. At one point, he told us that if he had any function left in his remaining hand, he'd use it to off himself. And the $5,000 we were fighting over? It was the estimated cost to renovate his bathroom so he could actually use it. Until then, he'd been forced to urinate and defecate in a bedpan in his living room. Sitting there, arguing over such a trivial amount of money in front of him, made me feel like an absolute piece of garbage. Story 5. I managed a legal aid office that helped survivors of domestic violence and SA. One of the custody cases I handled involved a father who was incredibly abusive and manipulative. The mother, my client, had numerous serious challenges, both stemming from the abuse and from the harsh circumstances she was facing in her life: mental health issues, physical health problems, financial struggles, and difficult family dynamics. The judge overseeing this case, unfortunately, was notorious for being an abuser himself. His approach to domestic violence cases was to only acknowledge the ones that fit his very narrow definition of real abuse. For the rest, he would verbally abuse the victims in court until they gave up and left. Having dealt with this judge before, I knew I had an ethical duty to prepare my client for the likely outcome of filing a custody petition. My goal wasn't to sway her decision but to ensure that she understood what would happen if she chose to pursue it. It was a tough conversation because I knew, with almost certainty, that if we moved forward, the father would aggressively lawyer up, making things even worse for her. The case would go to trial, and every flaw or challenge she had ever faced would be used against her. She would be painted in the worst possible light, attacked for being a bad mother, a terrible wife, and for allegedly making up the abuse. Her inability to support herself, her mental health struggles, and even her family's disbelief would all be used to discredit her, while the judge would likely side with the father. The ethical dilemma wasn't about whether or not I should help. The challenge was figuring out what would truly be in her best interest. I suspected that going through this process would be extremely harmful to her and would likely yield no material benefit. But I also believed in my ability to fight fiercely for her if she decided to pursue it. It's a common situation where clients, especially those who've experienced domestic violence, are uncertain about what is fair or reasonable to expect. Often, they look to their lawyer to make the decision for them because the process is overwhelming. Some lawyers, especially in these situations, may try to push the client in one direction or another, effectively taking control of the decision-making. But that's not how I approach things, particularly with clients who have experienced violence. The hardest part of my job was preparing my client to make an informed decision, knowing that by choosing to litigate, she would be exposing herself to more abuse. It was gut-wrenching to have to guide someone through such a painful process when I knew it would likely cause more harm than good. Story 6. I'm a family law attorney, and after handling countless divorces and custody disputes, most cases don't faze me anymore. But the ones that really stick with me are those where kids are caught in terrible situations, often because one or both parents are addicts. One case that hit me especially hard involved a divorce where I represented the father. The mother was a severe alcoholic who frequently brought random men home from the bar while the dad was working. The most heartbreaking part was hearing and seeing the evidence. Their young son calling his dad at work at 2 a.m., saying he was exhausted but couldn't sleep because his mom was blasting loud music and still partying with her friends. I was on the right side of that case, and thankfully, the dad gained custody. But witnessing the boy's distress and how deeply he was affected, it's the kind of thing that stays with you. Story 7. I once had a case involving a man accused of shooting a security guard after the guard slapped him for selling substances near a store. I had no doubt my client was responsible. The incident happened close to midnight, with poor lighting at the scene. The shooter was wearing a hoodie, and the only eyewitness who testified during the trial initially told police the suspect was black. My client wasn't Caucasian but also wasn't black, and that detail, in my opinion, played a significant role in convincing the jury. The verdict: not guilty. After the trial, my client thanked me through tears. His mother and grandmother later brought me a cake and a heartfelt thank you note. Less than a year later, I was watching the news. The report described a violent robbery where a group had held 3 families hostage in their apartments. They severely injured the janitor, tied up the families, and locked them in a bathroom, threatening to use an explosive if anyone tried to resist. One of the robbers briefly looked directly into an elevator camera before spray painting over it. The footage zoomed in on his face, and I recognized him immediately. It was my former client. Edit. For those asking, he was eventually identified but never apprehended. He managed to evade capture for about a year and a half before losing his life over a drug-related conflict. Story 8. I once represented a mother in a custody case where both parents were fighting for primary custody. The mom was struggling. She openly admitted to dealing with mental health challenges. During the case, the father took the child and kept them for several months, violating the court order. I managed to get the child returned to the mother. However, after meeting with both the mom and the child, it became clear that the child was thriving with the dad and would likely be better off staying with him. I tried to discuss this with the mom, but she wasn't receptive. Eventually, Child Protection Services got involved, and the court placed the child with the father. The last time I saw the mom, years later, she was still struggling with her health. The child, meanwhile, remained with the father and seemed to be in a much better situation. In the end, the best outcome for the child was reached, though not because of anything I did directly. Story 9. Not a specific case, but viewing child porn was pretty uncomfortable. As a defense attorney, you would go to the prosecutor's office to view the discovery files as they're prohibited from releasing it outside the office. So, You go in and sit down in a small room and a legal secretary brings you the discs with the files on them. On one case, I had to view the files more than once. So, imagine rolling in saying, "Hey, need to see that kid's dong again. Thanks." Also representing parents in Juvenile where I was fighting to return kids to pretty broken homes. Most of the time it didn't bother me, but in one case I represented a dad whose baby mama had just had these adorable twins. These parents were absolute jerks. Now a lot of the time, the foster families are one small step above the parents themselves, not people I would ever hire to babysit my kids. But in this case, the foster parents were a couple of 30-somethings who I presume couldn't have kids of their own. They would show up to court with the infant twins, and they bought them new dress for each court date. They wanted to adopt the kids, should the parental rights of the bio parents be terminated, so I felt pretty bad showing up trying to get the kids returned to the dad. I left that job before that case was completed, but I assume it had a happy ending. The judge was never going to return the kids to the parents. So, I like to think the couple has them now. Story 10. I don't usually handle family law cases, but I've got one where we suspect the mother has Munchausen by proxy. If you've seen the Hulu movie Gypsy, you can imagine how disturbing this situation is. The child was always fine with the father, but the mother would take the child to the doctor almost every other day. If she didn't get the diagnosis she wanted, she'd seek multiple second, third, or even fourth opinions. She was unusually close to the medical staff. The child had cancer and required a colostomy bag, but the mother neglected to clean it, leading to such severe infection that the child couldn't wear it anymore. As a result, the child's health worsened and they were deteriorating. The mother allegedly shoved the child into the shower, causing a head injury, and it's possible she was also feeding the child drugs, as they would occasionally vomit blood. Now, the child suffers from weekly seizures due to the shower incident. The mother also spent $400,000 on medical bills in 1 year. She created a fraudulent GoFundMe page, raising thousands but only using around $200 for the child's medical expenses. The GoFundMe page has since been taken down, and the case remains open while we work to secure more expert testimony. Story 11. When I was about to start college in the 90s, I took a receptionist job at a legal defense firm in my small southern town. I would answer the phones until 1 p.m., then spend a few unpaid hours shadowing one of the lawyers in court. The team was very kind and gave me the opportunity to observe, which ultimately helped me realize that becoming a lawyer wasn't the right path for me. I discovered that I couldn't handle watching people be crushed by the system. I could manage the murder trials, drug charges, and real estate disputes without issue. However, it was the cases involving poor people, caught up in minor offenses or simple mistakes, that really haunted me. These were small things that would follow them for the rest of their lives, and it was hard to watch. One case that particularly stands out involved a shooting, and a crowd had gathered around the body. A detective was asking if anyone had witnessed anything, and our defendant raised his hand, even though he hadn't actually seen anything. He just wanted to help. He was a simple-minded person, and though he hadn't been diagnosed with any conditions, it was clear he had some cognitive challenges. He had dropped out of school early, and there weren't any services in town to support him. When I met him, he was a genuinely sweet person who just liked being around people, but he struggled with reasoning and had a low IQ. The detectives separated him from the crowd and began questioning him. It quickly became clear that the defendant was just offering answers he thought the detective wanted to hear. He wanted to please him. Instead of dismissing him, the detective arrested him for giving false information. The defendant had a history of minor thefts, but those had been linked to his cognitive challenges. Now, because he had talked to the police, he was facing serious jail time. He didn't know better, he just liked to talk to people. Without any formal diagnosis or records, there was no way to show his reasoning issues. Anything like that would require money or a long wait in a state mental facility, neither of which he had access to. He lived with a relative who was equally struggling financially. His lawyer was considering a guilty plea because the defendant had admitted to lying to the police. I left before the case was resolved, but it's the one I still think about. This man was essentially harmless, yet he was likely going to spend time in jail, and the outcome would have been dire for him. What stuck with me the most was how unnecessary it all was. He was suffering for no reason. Putting him in jail wouldn't help him, nor would it improve his cognitive abilities. All it would do was make him distrustful of others. Story 12. The professor of my business law class shared a story with us about a time when he represented my hometown government in legal matters. In one case, local police were chasing a suspect, and during the pursuit, the suspect opened fire. The officers returned fire, but after the dust settled, They realized that one of their bullets had accidentally shot an innocent bystander. The bystander's family filed a lawsuit. It turned out she was transient and a drug addict, and she had been in the area trying to buy drugs. The family's attorney was demanding millions in restitution. My professor admitted he was scared at the prospect of having to argue before a jury that the family should not receive such a large amount because, as a drug addict, the woman's life was somehow less valuable. Fortunately, the city and the family settled out of court. I can't even imagine how difficult it would have been for my professor to make that argument in front of a jury. Who could stand before a jury and the family in the courtroom and argue that someone's life had no value? Story 13. I spent 7 months working at a criminal defense firm while in university, and 2 cases from that time left a lasting impact on me, which ultimately led me to decide that I would never practice criminal law again. The first case involved a teenage boy who, encouraged by his peers, coerced his 5-year-old sibling into performing an inappropriate act while recording it. When the client came in with his parents, he showed no remorse and didn't seem to care about the severity of the situation. When asked how he felt, he said he didn't know. What deeply disturbed me was that the young child was waiting outside during the interview, and the family all lived under the same roof. Despite the gravity of the situation, the teenager was sentenced to offender classes and given minimal punishment due to mitigating circumstances. The second case was one that, in my opinion, was a grave miscarriage of justice. An adult male had subjected his partner to severe domestic violence. The woman's child, who witnessed the abuse, called the police as the mother was unable to do so herself. This wasn't the first time the man had committed such acts, it was the second. The first time, he had received court-mandated anger management and domestic violence classes. This time, he was given the same punishment along with a suspended sentence. The client was indifferent to the situation. Even when his lawyer advised him that he might face jail time, he laughed it off, while his father, who was funding the defense, was left helpless and uncertain. I still don't understand why the client wasn't incarcerated, but it seemed that the prosecutor, for reasons unknown, didn't pursue a custodial sentence. These cases left me disillusioned with criminal law. The lack of appropriate consequences in such serious matters made it clear that this was not the field for me. Story 14. I'm an immigration lawyer, so the issues I often deal with include individuals attempting to gain permanent residency through fraudulent marriages or fake asylum claims. A few years ago, I was a junior attorney at a firm and was assigned a case involving the removal of conditions for permanent residency. In the US, if you marry someone and sponsor them for a green card, and the marriage is less than 2 years old, the green card issued is conditional and only valid for 2 years. To receive a full 10-year green card, additional paperwork is required. This process helps identify potential fraudulent cases. So, my boss hands me a case for the removal of conditions. I meet the husband, who is South American. He's impeccably groomed, tan despite the Midwest winter, fit, and dressed in expensive clothes, dripping in gold jewelry. He looks like a soap opera star. I prepare the necessary documents, and the couple comes in separately to sign them. The wife is about 15 years older than him, short, and somewhat plain, dressed in worn, unflattering clothes. She tells me that, in his culture, couples don't kiss or have intimate relations unless they want children, and that he's not ready to become a father yet. She adds that due to his work, he mostly stays in a coworker's spare bedroom across the city. She also provides photos to prove their marriage, many of which are from his recent birthday at a club. In the pictures, she's the only woman among a group of men, most of whom are shirtless, covered in glitter. Curious, I asked a fellow attorney who is gay what he thought. He immediately recognized the club as a gay bar he had visited before. We ended up filing the case without including the club photos, and the husband was granted his permanent green card. Story 15. Before transitioning to prosecution 2 years ago, I worked in defense. The hardest case I handled involved a man accused of inappropriate behavior towards his family friend's young daughters, who were 5 years old at the time. He hired us because he didn't want to register as a SA offender or face jail time. We knew the truth. We had listened to his interview with the police. Despite knowing what had happened, we were obligated to defend him to the best of our ability. We combed through the family's social media accounts, looking for evidence that could suggest the children might have learned this behavior elsewhere. We argued that they had been influenced by a vengeful family member. The entire process felt deeply uncomfortable and morally challenging. It was part of my job, but it left me with a sense of discomfort that stayed with me. Eventually, I made the decision to leave defense work and pursue a career as a prosecutor, focusing on domestic violence and SA cases, which is what I do now. Story 16. During law school, I had the opportunity to work in a juvenile defense clinic, where I spent several hours each week participating in hearings for juveniles who had just been arrested. These hearings were their first interaction with the court system, and the judge would decide whether they'd be released, placed on house arrest, or sent to a juvenile facility until their trial. One of the key factors in deciding whether a juvenile would be sent to a facility was whether a gun was involved. If so, the general rule was that they would be placed in a facility. If not, there was room for argument. A lot of my work involved speaking to the juveniles' families, teachers, and others to highlight positive aspects of their lives, aiming to get them the best possible outcome while preventing unnecessary long-term consequences. One case I worked on involved a boy who was accused of a very serious crime. Allegedly, he and a friend had gone to a nightclub. His friend was getting aggressive with a girl who wasn't interested, and in an attempt to intervene, my client showed her a gun, leading her into an alley. Once there, the boy allegedly forced the girl at gunpoint. Given the gravity of the charges, it was clear that this case was not going to end well for him. When I met the boy, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me with a cold, unsettling gaze. It was clear he didn't want help, and no one was there to support him. No parents, no friends, no teachers. It seemed like everyone preferred he be placed somewhere where he couldn't hurt anyone. In the hearing, the prosecutor presented the charges, and when it was my turn, I didn't have any counterarguments. I simply rested the defense, and the boy was sent to a juvenile facility pending trial. Afterward, my professor came up to me and told me he was proud of how I handled the case, considering the charges. However, he also reminded me that, as an attorney, I'd have to represent my clients to the best of my ability, regardless of my personal beliefs. That stuck with me, and ultimately, it's why I chose not to continue in law. Even though I passed the bar, I realized I couldn't practice law in a way that went against my personal values. Story 17. My experience is a bit different, as I've been fortunate enough not to face a truly morally challenging case, like defending someone or something deeply reprehensible. While there have been a few injury defense cases or situations where someone was dissatisfied with a deal, our approach was always to recommend that the client, or their insurance, settle and avoid dragging things out. The most challenging case I had involved a man with cancer who was suing every product he'd come into contact with. This is fairly common in product liability cases, where plaintiffs will initially cast a wide net and, through discovery, narrow it down to a few likely culprits. Thankfully, in this case, my client seemed highly unlikely to be a target, for reasons I won't go into. The moment that really stood out to me occurred one afternoon when I was discussing scheduling with my boss. We were going over the deposition details, pointing out how the plaintiff had likely lied about certain aspects of the case, and joking around about something unrelated when we both received a notification. We had an email. The plaintiff had passed away, and his attorney, along with his family, intended to refile the case as a wrongful death suit. For a brief moment, we just stood there in silence before my boss gave me instructions on how to proceed with advising the client, while he made calls to the opposing party's counsel. That moment stuck with me, not because I thought my client had any involvement in the man's illness. I genuinely believe they didn't, but for two reasons. First, it was the first time I'd worked on a case where someone I'd personally met, in the course of the case, passed away. In most of my cases, either the person was already deceased or had recovered from their injuries. Second, the reality that we had to immediately shift our focus from the loss of life to treating it as a legal event was hard to process at the time. A few months later, I moved on from that practice area to business dispute litigation, which felt like a better fit for me going forward. Story 18. I was a criminal defense attorney and represented someone accused of a very serious crime involving a child. The facts of the case were extremely difficult and distressing. In the end, the verdict was not guilty, primarily because the victim, due to her age, was unable to provide clear testimony, and the detective handling my client's statement was found to be dishonest. I uncovered several key inconsistencies in the detective's account during the trial. While the case resulted in a full acquittal, I couldn't shake the overwhelming discomfort I felt. As a defense attorney, my role is to ensure the fairness of the process and hold the government accountable, but that doesn't make it any easier when the case itself is so challenging. I cried in my wife's arms that night. Story 19. I worked as an intern for the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the body responsible for prosecuting war crimes and overseeing appeals related to the Yugoslav wars. After all the trials were completed, the ICTY merged with the ICTR, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, to form the MICT, Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals, which now handles ongoing issues from both tribunals. During my time there, I worked in the prosecutor's office, specifically preparing cross-examinations of defense witnesses in the trial of Ratko Mladic, whose appeal is still being heard before the MICT. Interns from prosecution, defense, and the judicial office would occasionally socialize together. I heard reports that Mladic was inappropriate with the female interns, making advances and calling them pretty, though I can't confirm an incident of more severe behavior. Although we weren't forbidden from interacting with defense interns, there was an unspoken rule that we wouldn't discuss the trial. From what I could gather, the defense team didn't seem overly shaken by the crimes their client was accused of, such as the mass murder of Bosnians, Croats, and Muslims. However, being in the courtroom with Mladic, so close yet so far, was chilling. The sheer horror and despair his actions caused were overwhelming. He was often compared to figures like Goebbels due to the scale and cruelty of his crimes. I went through the evidence, photos of mass graves, testimonies of survivors. One account I remember vividly described a woman who witnessed her family being murdered before her eyes and then was taken and sold. She was later forced to make friends with another young girl who was also held captive. These are the kinds of atrocities that war crimes involve. While I firmly believe everyone deserves a defense to ensure a just system, that doesn't change the fact that individuals responsible for such acts should face severe punishment and their crimes should be remembered for history's sake. Story 20. I am a South African advocate, and I worked on a tragic case involving a mother accused of culpable homicide in connection with the death of her 5-year-old son. Over 2 years, she and her partner subjected the child to frequent beatings for trivial reasons, such as being hungry. After the child developed a medical condition, they sought hospital care but lied about his symptoms, which went undiagnosed. One day, while watching TV, the child had a seizure, resulting in a severe head injury and internal bleeding. Rather than immediately seeking help, the mother took the child's body to her bedroom, dressed him in winter clothing despite the sweltering heat, and left him face down on the floor for hours before calling for assistance. The autopsy revealed that the child was malnourished, had multiple bruises, and had burns on his body. I vividly remember consulting with the mother, who cried and blamed her circumstances, including a history of substance use. She denied any involvement in the child's injuries, even claiming that the child had inflicted them on himself. In an unfortunate turn of events, my instructing attorney made an unethical mistake by submitting a forged plea agreement with my signature, which I was unaware of, which gave me the opportunity to withdraw from the case. The mother was found guilty of culpable homicide due to her negligence, as it could not be proven that she was directly responsible for the fatal injuries. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Story 21. A lawyer friend of mine occasionally shares some of the tough cases he's worked on. The first one involved a divorce where both parents were fighting over about $10,000 in child support paid over 10 years. Each side ended up spending around $50,000 on legal fees to settle this issue. The whole thing was fueled by their hatred for each other, and the real victim in the situation was their child, who was caught in the middle. The second case involved a significant investment in a company. An investor put about $6 million into the company, but the company's officers mismanaged the funds, spending it irresponsibly in Las Vegas and moving it into their own accounts and trusts. When the investor requested an accounting of the money, they were ignored, so after several months, the investor filed a lawsuit. In response, the officers filed for personal bankruptcy. The investor tried to challenge the bankruptcy, which could potentially strip away the protection it offered the officers. If successful, the officers would lose their bankruptcy protection, and creditors could go after them aggressively. After many months of negotiations, the officers agreed to settle. The investor didn't recover much, with a payment plan stretched out over 7 years. The settlement included a hefty clause, with a $4 million non-dischargeable judgment against the officers if they failed to meet the terms. There was even a clause stating that if any officer died by suicide, the debt would still stand. The bankruptcy judge deemed the settlement too harsh, however, and didn't approve it. The whole ordeal took a toll on my friend, who was representing the investors, and he turned to heavy drinking after the case. Story 22. I can't go into too much detail, but my first job was in internal investigations. For those who aren't familiar, this practice involves a company hiring a law firm when it's under government investigation. The government typically doesn't provide a lot of specifics about why they're investigating, and if the top executives are clean, they might not know what's going on. That's where the law firm comes in. With legal privilege, the firm conducts an internal investigation to understand what the company did that could be linked to the government's probe. This allows the company to better understand the situation and negotiate from an informed position. Let me tell you, The company I worked with had some questionable practices. One individual, in particular, had become a specialist in special projects and had developed clever ways to bribe people and funnel money to individuals who shouldn't have been receiving it. But the real issue was that the laws the company was being investigated for violating were relatively new. While they had been on the books for about 15 years, they hadn't really been enforced until about 2 years before I joined. This created a culture within the company where many employees believed the laws were unnecessary or irrelevant. We had to constantly remind people that things like giving a luxury ski trip to a Saudi official was considered bribery, even if they could afford it themselves. Ultimately, my job was to work for the company, and legally, I was bound to protect their information, no matter what I found during the investigation. Story 23. A husband and wife ran a foster home, and one of the former children in their care accused the father of inappropriate behavior. The child also claimed there were other victims and prior complaints from other children against this same individual. I was asked to defend only the wife under their homeowner's policy, which did not cover the husband for these serious allegations. Initially, it was believed that the wife had no knowledge of what was happening and was just as shocked by the accusations. I thought we were helping a woman who wanted to care for children and was now caught in a difficult situation. However, as the investigation progressed and records from the county were gathered, it became clear that the wife was aware of previous concerns but had chosen to ignore them, continuing to bring in more children for years. It was a deeply troubling discovery. The case was paused after the couple filed for bankruptcy, and my firm was able to withdraw from representing the woman. I have no idea what happened to them afterward. This case was far outside of what I typically handle and is the only time I've felt so uncomfortable working with a client. Story 24. Not my side of the case, but I really felt for the opposing counsel. I worked in insurance defense for a party loosely affiliated with a medical malpractice case. Discovery revealed, somewhat late, that the doctor involved had a SA claim filed against him, but there was no adverse ruling or conclusion to that claim. The situation escalated when a friend of the plaintiff gave a deposition the day after this information came to light. She concocted an elaborate story about overhearing a phone call with the plaintiff, where she claimed the doctor was SAing her. Keep in mind, the plaintiff wasn't exactly an ideal candidate, older, not particularly attractive, and recently out of surgery. The plaintiff's attorney asked for a break as soon as possible. His body language clearly showed he knew this was about to backfire, and he quickly took the witness out of the room, presumably to get her to correct her testimony. But she didn't. What could he do? He couldn't directly contradict her, he wasn't there. He couldn't end the deposition, although with more strategy, he could have handled it better. The whole thing was excruciating to watch, as the attorney leading the deposition essentially played with the witness for 30 minutes, while the plaintiff's attorney just had to sit there and take it. Story 25. I've been a child custody attorney in the Eastern Pennsylvania Judicial District for nearly 30 years, primarily handling cases involving low-income families in Philadelphia. Many of these disputes stem from challenging and sometimes violent circumstances. Early in my career, I worked with a single mother seeking custody of her teenage son. The father, unfortunately, was unreliable, frequently absent, and entangled in questionable situations. Securing custody for the mother was straightforward since the father neither demonstrated the capability nor the willingness to parent. Pennsylvania law often leans in favor of granting mothers custody, even in complicated circumstances. As an aside, a colleague of mine in Pittsburgh once secured custody for a mother who was unemployed, living in someone else's living room, and receiving SSI due to a disability. She also had a history of substance abuse, while the father had a stable job and his own apartment. The real challenge came after my client was awarded custody. She was understandably protective of her son, fearful that he might end up in jail or worse, given the environment they lived in. He was a black teenager in a high-risk neighborhood, with aspirations of being a street artist, which often put him at odds with local authorities. Her concerns were valid, but they sometimes led to her being overly controlling. A few months later, her fears almost came true. Her son and his friends were at a school basketball court when they saw two men breaking into cars nearby. Instead of calling the police, they confronted the men, who, it turned out, were adults with criminal records. An argument escalated into a physical fight. Neighbors called the police, and when officers arrived, they found a chaotic scene involving young black men. Guns were drawn, and everyone was arrested. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, and her son walked away with only a few bruises. However, the incident shook the mother deeply. She contacted me, saying she could no longer handle raising her son in such a volatile environment. She was terrified that the next time might have a far worse outcome. She wanted to transfer guardianship to her sister, who lived out of state. I tried to reassure her, explaining, it was just a fight. Yes, the police got involved, but no one was seriously hurt. Uprooting him and separating him from his immediate family might do more harm than good. But her mind was made up. She was adamant about moving him to a safer place. That's when she told me, he's going to live with his auntie and uncle in Bel Air. And just like that, the story took a turn straight out of a sitcom. He caught a cab, complete with dice in the mirror and a fresh license plate, and headed off to a better life. When he arrived, he stepped out and declared, "Yo, home, smell ya later." Finally, he looked at his new home, ready to start his life as the Prince of Bel Air. Story 26. When I was in law school, I quickly realized that unless you consciously steer yourself toward work that aligns with your values, you might end up doing things you deeply dislike. So, I made a promise to myself, I would never work for a corporation, represent criminal defendants, or practice family law. Fortunately, I landed at a plaintiff's firm where I have the privilege of being selective with my cases. I focus on non-vehicle-related personal injury, workers' compensation for employees, and disability claims. I've never regretted the work I've done or the outcomes I've achieved. For me, it all boils down to this. As an attorney, you have to advocate zealously for your client. That means choosing your clients carefully and putting yourself in situations where, if you win a case because of your skills, you can live with the result. I have no issue taking money from a corporate entity and redirecting it to a hardworking individual. The only times I ever feel bad are when I lose, not when I win. I don't think I'd feel the same way if I were working for the defense side, handling criminal cases, or practicing in areas I don't morally align with. Story 27. In the legal world, the terms legal, smart, and moral don't always align. While actions can certainly fall into all three categories, some decisions can be legal and moral but not necessarily smart. The most morally difficult cases are those where a client has been wronged, but circumstances make holding someone accountable far too expensive or complicated to pursue. Telling a client, you've been harmed by someone who broke the law, but there's nothing we can do about it because it's not feasible to bring the case, is an incredibly tough conversation. Disclaimer: none of the following is legal advice, and you shouldn't rely on random internet opinions for legal guidance. For example, bringing a medical malpractice suit can be costly. Some states require hiring medical experts to present necessary evidence, and some place caps on the damages you can recover. I've witnessed severe wrongdoing overlooked simply because the likely responsible party knows that most people can't afford to pursue legal action. Every case is significant to the clients involved. Losing or facing a poor outcome is always difficult. However, telling a client that someone will avoid consequences because it's too costly to fight feels even more morally challenging. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.